Good morning. Hope everybody is having a good Saturday here so far. It's about noon on Saturday, October 22nd, and wanted to invite you to our Brunch with Brandon here this weekend, where we're going to talk about some really important updates as it relates to inherited retirement accounts and some interpretation that has been long overdue and very confusing up until this point. This session may be a little bit shorter. There's so much intricacy as it relates to these different scenarios where inherited IRAs or retirement accounts can have different rules. So I'm going to speak much more high level, but of course, if you do have any questions or want a little more detail, let me know, and I'd be happy to try and help answer those in a little bit more of a detailed version as well. But the gist of what I wanted to cover today is, let's say, twofold. One is the changes in the Secure Act that passed 2 years ago, and maybe just a week or two ago, some final interpretation or at least guidance as far as what we can expect, believe it or not, finally here in 2022 on required distributions. And the second is a very commonly missed factor in this, which may require that your distributions are paid out over 5 years instead of 10. Okay, so those are the two things I'm going to cover, but before I jump into the updates on this, what I want to do is go back. So all the way back to 2020, before we ever even heard of this thing called COVID, at the very end of 2019, there was a legislation passed called the Secure Act. And this was a retirement bill essentially meant to help retirees put aside more and have a little more flexibility. There was a lot to this bill. But one of the biggest things that came out of it, and more to the negative side, was that if you have a retirement account and that passes on to a family member, not necessarily a spouse, these are the nuances, but a family member, let's say a kid or a loved one that's younger than you, something along those lines, before the Secure Act, your beneficiary could stretch out those distributions. They had to take money out typically, but they could stretch it out based on their lifetime. So it was a very small amount, especially if it went to a 20-year-old, for instance, over their lifetime that they had to take out every year. Now, what the Secure Act said was now, instead of being able to stretch that over the beneficiary's lifetime, it actually must all be taken out within 10 years. Okay? Now, here's where the interpretation comes into play, because everybody interpreted this to mean that you could take all of it out year 1, you could take all of it out year 10, you could spread it out. It didn't matter as long as it was all gone by the end of the 10th year, you were in good shape. Then, earlier in 2022 here, the IRS came along and said, no, that's not how we're interpreting this law. And in fact, the way that we're looking at it is that you must take out money every year still and deplete it in the 10 years, okay? Now, there was no official ruling on that. That was their interpretation. They said they were going to come back to it by the end of the year. And here we are finally, end of October of 2022, and we have a little more detail. The reason that this is so important is because almost nobody was taking these distributions. They didn't think they were required to, right? And so the question came up, well, if we're forced to take out these distributions, are we going to also owe penalties on missed distributions over the last 2 years? Now, here's what the IRS says late October 2022. The IRS says that there is no required distribution for years 2021 and 2022. So, if you've inherited an IRA since the Secure Act passed, you did not have to take distributions in 2021 or 2022. However, they still have not ruled as to whether or not moving forward there are going to be required distributions. So that's the rule looking backwards. The question still remains in 2023 and onward, are you going to be required to take distributions from these inherited accounts? So I will definitely keep you posted as we know more about that, but this is really important because if you were following this, you were probably getting concerned as year end grew closer as to whether or not you needed to take money out. The short answer is for 2022, you do not, but we need to pay close attention and see what they finally say about the years moving forward. Okay. So that's the biggest thing I wanted to cover. Again, if you have more questions on that, it depends on when the person passed. It depends on who the money goes to. There's all kinds of different nuances to this, but generally speaking, that is the rule. Obviously, this is really important if you've received funds from a family member if you've inherited a retirement account. But for a lot of our clients, we're working on some estate planning strategies. They may have a good chunk in IRAs and 401ks, and their question is, how do we pass this efficiently to our kids without being forced to take all this money out quickly, pay taxes on it, all the above. So something to consider is that although those rules still apply to the Roth side of the equation, because it's tax-free, it's a little less of an impact. Okay. Now, part 2 of this is something that is very often missed. It's called the 5-year payout rule. So we talked about what happens when you have a named beneficiary. They must take it all out in 10 years. Second part of this is if you happen to have a non-named beneficiary, let's just say the retirement account goes to your estate or certain types of a trust or something along those lines, where it's not an officially named beneficiary or a person named as a beneficiary, the rule now shrinks. So rather than being able to take it out over 10 years, the rule is now 5 years, okay? So this is really, really important, and for the most part, relatively easy to avoid. We've been working really hard this year on making sure our clients have contingent beneficiaries on their retirement accounts. This is a good way to handle it. A lot of times what we'll see is a person will have a beneficiary as a primary, maybe as their spouse or something along those lines. But what we don't have set up a lot of times are contingents. In other words, if you and your spouse are the beneficiaries on each other's accounts, what happens if your spouse predeceases you or if you passed away at the same time, knock on wood? A lot of times there are not beneficiaries named for that type of scenario. This is called a contingent or a secondary beneficiary, and this might be a really good thing to consider if you're in that boat, to try and minimize anyways, maybe not entirely avoid, but minimize the impacts of this 5-year distribution rule. Okay, so that's really what I wanted to cover again today. It's basically a new interpretation of the Secure Act, which again, number 1 means that you do not have to take out required distributions for 2021 and 2022 on inherited retirement accounts. By the way, this is if it was after the Secure Act passed. Keep that in mind. If you received it before, all the old RMD rules still apply. Okay. The second is that if you have a non-person, let's say, named as your beneficiary, that again, that timeline shrinks from 10 years to 5. So hopefully that's really helpful. Again, unfortunately, there's still no guidance as to what they'll be looking at for 2023 and beyond. But nonetheless, as we get close to the end of 2022, some of you may have been trying to figure out what to do here, and hopefully this is helpful as you kind of determine some year-end strategies and required distributions and all the above. So thanks as always for joining me here. I hope you have a great Saturday. It looks like the rain is starting to clear up finally, although it was very much needed with the smoke. So have a great Saturday, enjoy your weekend, and we'll see you on the next Brunch with Brandon.